There is a specific kind of financial destruction that never makes headlines. Not the dramatic crash, not the obvious fraud, not the reckless gamble that anyone watching could have predicted. The kind nobody talks about is quieter, slower, and far more complex. It is the destruction that happens inside a mind that is functioning exactly as designed, doing precisely what brains are built to do in an environment the brain was never built to handle. He lost everything while feeling completely in control. That is the part worth investigating. He had spent 11 years building something real, not inherited, not lucky, built through genuine work, genuine analysis, and a track record that had earned him the respect of people who understood what the numbers meant. He had navigated downturns. He had made unpopular calls that turned out to be correct. He had, by every honest measure, demonstrated that his judgment was sound. And exactly that was the beginning because somewhere in a decade of being right, something changed inside the machinery. Not in his character, not in his intelligence, in the architecture of how his brain was processing information. Quietly, invisibly, without a single alarm. He did not know it was happening. That is not an excuse. That is the most important fact in this entire investigation. The human brain is not a rational instrument that occasionally gets hijacked by emotion. That framing is backwards, and it has misled financial thinking for a generation. The brain is a pattern-matching, threat-detecting, survival-oriented system that occasionally produces rational analysis. The rational analysis is the exception. The pattern recognition is the default, and the pattern recognition runs faster, quieter, and with far more authority than the conscious mind ever realizes. When you look at a financial opportunity, you believe you are evaluating it. You are running numbers. You are assessing risk. What is actually happening beneath all of that visible activity is that the brain has already matched the situation against its library of past experience, assigned it a threat or reward rating, and delivered a verdict before the conscious analysis even began. The analysis that follows is real, but it is downstream of a conclusion that was already reached. Daniel Kahneman called this the battle between System 1 and System 2. System 1, fast, emotional, automatic, invisible. System 2, slow, deliberate, rational, visible. The insight that most financial education refuses to absorb is that System 2 does not supervise System 1. System 1 reaches a conclusion first. System 2 then builds the case for it. What feels like independent rational thinking is, more often than most people can accept, post hoc justification for a judgment the emotional brain already made. He was a System 2 person. He believed that fully. He had the vocabulary, the frameworks, the demonstrated discipline to override emotion when evidence demanded it. What he did not have, what almost nobody has, is the ability to detect when System 2 has been quietly recruited to serve System 1 rather than check it. The opportunity looked exactly like every opportunity that had worked before. Same structure, same signals, same feeling. His brain did what trained brains do. It recognized the pattern and generated confidence. He ran the analysis. The analysis confirmed the confidence. He committed more capital than usual because the conviction was higher than usual. And the conviction was higher than usual because a decade of success had trained his brain to one lesson, repeated hundreds of times. When it feels like this, what his brain could not tell him was that this situation, despite every surface resemblance, was operating in a different environment, with variables his pattern library had never encountered. The map looked right, the terrain had changed, and the difference was invisible because the map was the only instrument he trusted. Before we go further, pause here. Think about the last financial decision you made that felt obvious, not uncertain. Obvious. Ask yourself honestly, did you examine it or did you defend it? Did you look for reasons it might be wrong or only for reasons it was right? There is a gap between those two things, a significant one. and most people cannot tell which one they are doing in the moment. If that question lands somewhere uncomfortable, go to the comments and write mirror, because that discomfort is exactly the territory this channel exists to explore. Back to him. Nassim Taleb described this mechanism through the image of a turkey, fed every morning for 1,000 days. Each feeding reinforces the turkey's model humans provide. Mornings are safe, the world is reliable. With every confirming data point, the model becomes more certain, more established, more unquestionable. Until the morning it meets the one piece of information the model was never built to contain. The turkey did not fail to think. It thought consistently, using every tool available. It simply could not see the edge of what its experience covered. A decade of success is 1,000 feedings, and the brain that built the model cannot see where the model ends and the unknown begins. The position moved against him. This is where the second mechanism entered, and this one is even more ancient and more deeply wired than the first. Loss aversion, the asymmetric, neurologically hardwired response to potential loss that researchers have documented to be roughly twice as psychologically powerful as the equivalent gain. In a declining position, loss aversion does not produce calm reassessment. It produces a state closer to paralysis dressed, dangerously, in the language of discipline. Holding felt like conviction. It felt like the mature refusal to panic at the bottom. Every serious investor knows you do not sell at the bottom. Every serious investor knows that discipline means staying in when it is uncomfortable. Those principles are real. In many contexts, they are correct. But the brain operating under loss aversion is not applying them as principles. It is reaching for them as emotional cover, as reasons not to feel the full weight of what is happening. The vocabulary of investing had become the armor that fear was wearing to avoid examination. He held. The position continued moving against him. He held longer. And something else entered, something that sealed the outcome more completely than anything else. He had mentioned the investment to people he respected, not as a boast, just as part of ordinary conversation about what he was working on. A colleague, a close friend, someone whose opinion carried weight. The position had become social. And the moment a financial position becomes social, the cost of exiting it is no longer only financial. It is now also the cost of being wrong in front of people. The cost of the conversation where you explain, the cost of revising the story you have been quietly telling about who you are and what you know. Ego had entered the position. Not loudly, just as a silent additional weight on the side of holding, raising the threshold for exit by fractions that compounded into something decisive. Here is a question I want you to sit with honestly. Have you ever stayed in a financial decision longer than the evidence supported, partly because changing course meant admitting something you were not ready to admit? Not to a bank, not to an advisor, to yourself, to someone whose respect you needed. If the answer is yes, go to the comments and describe the situation in one line. Because naming it, even briefly, is the beginning of the only process that actually changes it. The honest accounting of what happened revealed 4 mechanisms operating simultaneously beneath every decision. The first was the illusion of skill, the inability to accurately separate genuine analytical ability from the contribution of a favorable cycle and compounding luck. His success was real, but it was not entirely his. The portion that belonged to luck was invisible in the data, because luck and skill, in a strong environment, produce identical results. The brain attributes outcomes to the decision maker because the decision maker is the only variable the brain has direct access to. The second was what Kahneman called Wysiati. What you see is all there is. The brain builds its model from available information and then behaves as if the available information is complete. It does not generate uncertainty in proportion to what is missing. It generates confidence in proportion to how coherent what it has appears to be. A compelling story built from incomplete data produces more certainty than a less compelling story built from fuller data. He had a compelling story. The completeness of what he didn't know never registered as a factor. The third was commitment escalation, the psychological phenomenon by which prior investment of capital, of time, of identity makes exit progressively more costly in ways entirely disconnected from future prospects. Every month he held, the position became more his, more loaded with what abandoning it would mean. The rational question, what does this position's future look like, independent of its past, became harder to ask cleanly, because the past was accumulating inside the question, changing its weight without changing its words. The fourth, he found hardest to accept. Ego. Not the loud ego of the amateur, the quiet, sophisticated ego of an experienced professional who has come, slowly and invisibly, to believe that his judgment occupies a category slightly above the ordinary. Not arrogance, something more subtle, a small, persistent assumption that his read of a situation is probably more accurate than consensus, because his personal history had provided enough evidence to make that assumption feel reasonable rather than dangerous. That assumption is the final stage before collapse for more serious investors than anyone wants to count. Here is the truth that almost no financial content will say plainly. Confidence is not information. The feeling of certainty is a neurological state, not an accurate signal. The brain produces it in response to pattern recognition, narrative coherence, and accumulated past confirmation. It produces it with equal conviction whether the underlying judgment is correct or catastrophically wrong. You cannot tell the difference from the inside. Not reliably. Not without external structure specifically designed to create that separation. The investors who compound wealth across decades share one trait that is not intelligence, not access, not superior analysis. It is a structural, almost mechanical skepticism directed specifically at their own moments of greatest certainty, not paralysis. A deliberate habit of asking what would have to be true for this to be wrong, conducted genuinely, against the strong resistance of a brain that finds that question threatening. The brain does find it threatening. Examining your own certainty feels like disloyalty to your own judgment, like the first step toward indecision, like an invitation to lose the edge that success built. The brain will generate those feelings efficiently and convincingly every time genuine scrutiny is attempted. And the more experienced you are, the more sophisticated the resistance becomes. He rebuilt, slowly, with a fundamentally different relationship to his own certainty. He still invests, he still trusts his analysis, but he has built external systems whose only purpose is to slow him down when conviction is highest. When something feels obvious, that is now the signal to look harder. The feeling of inevitability is no longer confirmation. It is a flag. That shift from treating certainty as a green light to treating it as a prompt for deeper examination does not come naturally. It runs against every instinct the brain has developed through a lifetime of using confidence as a guide. It requires rebuilding the relationship between feeling and decision at a depth most financial education never reaches. Because most financial education focuses on what to decide rather than how the brain decides. And that gap between the mechanics of financial instruments and the mechanics of the mind operating them is where most wealth is actually lost. Not in bad markets, not in bad luck. In good brains, doing exactly what good brains do. In an environment those brains were never designed for. So here is the question worth sitting with. In your financial life right now, where are you most certain? And when did you last genuinely try to prove yourself wrong? Take that to the comments. Not the public answer, the honest one. Because the distance between those two is exactly where this work began.